When we received the video, we basically started researching without any other context to this massacre, only from the footage itself. The real breakthrough was when Ansar found the perpetrator on Facebook, and then we sent a friend request, but then he accepted.
Ansar, you actually went undercover to solicit some response from the perpetrator with a fictitious online persona.
Yes. Anna is a product of research and also hard work. We studied the perpetrators, we studied the ecosystem of the Syrian regime. Anna was a lawyer who studied in Holland and wanted to do research on and convey the voices of pro-Assad to the Western world. She is a middle-class girl, well-educated, from a family who was suffering from the war because of the opposition. So we built such a narrative based on different stories, which make the story believable by the perpetrators. For Amjad, when he first talked to us, it was like very short. He had some questions and he was explaining his position and what he did, his experience, his view of the Syrian regime, of the NDF, and other issues. He believes in the monopoly of violence of the state, and that state can do everything, and there is no limit to the state power. So he believes in the institution, as he called himself, as son of the institution.
So you developed a rapport with Amjad. Anna gained the trust of Amjad.
Yes. Later, when he confessed to the killing of civilians, he didn't say civilians, he said, I killed so many. I don't remember how many he killed. I think he was under influence of alcohol. So he was drinking and smoking. So when he talked, he was more transparent about his emotion than usually when we talk to him before or after that. Then we asked him, what are you doing here? What's going on in this video? He said, I'm just doing my work.
What did he do when he realized who you really were, that Anna was a fictitious online persona and that you were actually documenting his words and sometimes even videotaping him?
He promised to kill everyone I love in life. And it was the last time we talked to him.
And is Anna's Facebook profile still live?
No. Anna is dead.
Not only dead, but she's also buried. It was a burden, especially for Ansar, to crawl into the skin of a pro-regime person for over 2 years. So we realized at some point we had to commit euthanasia. We know from psychologists, they will say that rituals are important, punctuated, transition, turning points. So instead of just quitting and just turning off this Facebook profile, Ansar actually had the idea of creating a little box of mementos. So we printed out her Facebook profile. We put in a couple of pro-regime trinkets and things like this. And then we drove to a nearby forest. We dug a hole and we, literally with a spade. And then we put her in the hole. We covered it up. We held 1 minute of silence.
Did anyone see you?
There was a guy walking his dog. He must have thought it's kind of weird. Two of these people, kind of shifty and with a spade in their hand, that's kind of strange.
So, in many ways, both of you are still processing.
This is the most hellish question that one could ask, because we needed a sense of empathy with the perpetrators to be able to get close to them, to try to understand them, not immediately condemn them, but to try to understand them and interview them. Like, why are they doing this? But the moment that we allowed ourselves to be, and we had to be very vigilant against it, to have too much empathy, that would have been really morally devastating to us, because you see these people in their last minutes, in their last seconds, and when you try to think about what must have gone through their minds, it's a profoundly difficult exercise, because most of them die in silence. They might have been incredulous, like, why am I being executed? I'm innocent.
Thank you everybody for coming along. This is basically not the core subject of the talk today, but it was meant to kind of give you a sense of the kind of unique work that Uğur and his colleagues do on Syria. Remarkable work. This piece that they wrote for us actually received at least 2 awards. It's an award-winning article, and there's a long list of impact that has helped produce on a legal and political. I think the guy behind this has been arrested in Syria. There's a rumor, I think, that he was arrested. I don't know if it was public. But just to introduce our guest today, Üngör is a professor of Holocaust and Genocide Studies at the University of Amsterdam and the Neon Institute in Amsterdam as well. He's with us today to talk about his latest book, The Syrian Gulag Inside Assad's Prisons. It's a fascinating book. It's highly recommended. It's written with a Syrian author who has personal experience inside Syrian prisons, Jabir Bakr. So we wanted to start first with sort of just opening remarks from our guest about the book, and then we'll take it from there. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the kind invitation, and thank you all for being here. It's a pleasure. Even though this is, of course, a difficult topic, and also we're going through pretty rough times. The book that we wrote together with Jabir Bakr, who's a researcher, independent researcher, and survivor of Saydnaya, one of the largest prisons in Syria, is a book that we started working on in 2017 in collaboration, and we can maybe talk about that collaboration a bit later. But the main impetus for the book was actually the fact that such a book didn't exist yet. So the fact that we didn't, an overview of the Syrian prisons that have been around for half a century didn't exist. We had, of course, memoirs, and there are a number of relatively famous memoirists, such as Mustafa Khalifa and a number of others, who've written really very astute, profound memoirs about their times in prison, but we didn't have an overview. We had no idea not only how many prisons there were, but also what the different conditions were, how the system geared into each other. So we started working on it. Jabir conducted about 100 interviews. I did about 50, many of whom were in prison, and also family members of people who were in prison, because the impact is broader than just the detainees and survivors. And then, of course, there was the pandemic, so we wrote it also through the pandemic, and it came out first in Dutch, and then now it's out in English. We're pretty happy with the result. And the book basically has 2 arguments. One is that the Syrian prison system is a 4-dimensional system of 4 separate but interlocking and related imprisonment systems that gear into each other and together produce a systemic form of violence. So it's not just a series of prisons where, if you commit a crime, drunk driving, or you hit a police officer or whatever, you're arrested for the crime, you put in prison, and then the point is then to reintegrate people through parole. That's not what the Syrian prison system is about. It's about detaining massively, torturing massively, disappearing and traumatizing a large number of people who are in there mostly 95% for political reasons, or alleged political reasons. And these 4 dimensions are the intelligence agencies, so the 4 major branches: the military intelligence, the Air Force intelligence, political security, and the state security. That's one dimension of the system. The second dimension are the central prisons, the 3 big ones: Mezze, Tedmor or Palmyra, and Saydnaya. And number 3 are the civil prisons, which are kind of the normal prisons, quote unquote, for, let's say, ordinary crimes. And then the fourth dimension, which became really prominent since 2011, are the secret prisons. And there are a large number of those as well, because any militia basically had wide fiats to arrest whoever they wanted and to imprison them for a particular period, and to keep them there or to hand them over to the mukhabarat, to the intelligence agencies. And these four dimensions, on the one hand, they're separate, but they also gear into each other in a sophisticated way, namely that the intelligence agencies are like a vacuum cleaner. They descend upon Syrian society, they arrest people, they keep them, they torture them. Sometimes you stay there for a longer time and sometimes shorter time. Then you can either be handed over to the civil prisons and released, or you end up in one of the big three of the central prisons, the military prisons. And then after that, you stay there until you are released, or a lot of people die in these prisons, of course, because the point is to exterminate, actually, as many people as possible. And that's why also, that's the reason in this first argument that we call it gulag. Gulag, the use of the term is very deliberate. We didn't want to use it as a populist term, for example, because, I mean, there are books out there with the title Britain's Gulag, and that's about the war of decolonization in Kenya, when the British Army put, various rebel groups in camps. Or there's a book, I think, called American Gulag, which is about the American vast penitentiary system. It's not for that reason. We talked with actual Soviet experts of Gulag, and we explained them how the Syrian system works, and they agreed with us that it was legitimate to use it for a number of reasons, but primarily because the prison system has a disproportionate impact on Syrian society. So not people who are in prison, but also people who are not in prison, they think about it every day. There's one thing that I don't want to happen to me, which is I don't want to end up in that building, in that prison. So it structures the society in disproportionate ways. That's one argument, and the second argument is, what's the point of all of this? The mass arrest, torture, and detention is to depoliticize Syrian society, to demobilize Syrians, to make sure that they do not step up and organize, form meaningful ways of dissent and opposition to the regime. And there are basically two boxes of politics. There's permissible politics, which are obviously the Ba'ath Party, and then there's a parliament in Syria which has political parties. But these parties, as you know, are called in Arabic Ahzab Shekliya, so they are bogus parties, it's not real opposition. And then there's a box of impermissible politics, which can be anything from the liberals to the communists to the Muslim Brotherhood to every single person who dared to step into the street and demonstrate in 2011 or even post something on Facebook, as simple as that. And the moment that you step into that box, then your punishment is arrest, detention, torture, and go through the prison system, basically. These are two arguments of the book. And it's been received fairly well. Most survivors that we interviewed, they felt a sense of vindication or redemption, that finally the world knows what we went through, and that was really important for us. And the English language book came out just last week, so we'll see how it will be received.
Can we give also a sense of the book and the prose and what's written in the book? I think we talked about maybe reading some extracts from the book.
Yeah,
that's possible.
Yeah, so the one, I do that with an anecdote that I memorized that's verbatim in the book. So there are two sections in the book, and in between there are these vignettes, like short stories, personal stories that encapsulate, actually, in a nutshell, what this system is about. And my, in quotation mark, favorite anecdote is an interview that we did. Jabir interviewed him, and I also separately interviewed a survivor who one day was a young man who was a student who was arrested for posting something on Facebook in 2011 that was perceived as critical of the regime. So he was arrested. Two men came to his dormitory, threw him in the trunk of the car, and drove him to somewhere underground. He was tortured there for 3 months. He suffered a spinal hernia. He suffered major trauma to the soles of his feet because of the type of torture that's used, the falaka, the beating under the soles. And then one day he was put in the same trunk and then dumped in the middle of a street in broad daylight. And he basically walked home. His mother fainted when she saw him. And then he couldn't sleep. He had nightmares for months on end. And then 3 months later, 2 men knocked on his door in the middle of the night. And they said, come with us to the branch. We're just going to drink a cup of coffee for 5 minutes. And that generally is the kind of buzzword for that you're going away for a long time. And he said, sir, but I just came out of prison. I was arrested already. And the man said, well, that's not by us. That was political security. We are the Air Force intelligence. So that says a lot about the type of institutional duplication that exists in Syria. And again, he was tortured for another 3 months, after which he left the country. So that kind of, in a nutshell, in one biography of a young man who's now 29 years old, it really encapsulates the system.
Also, we wanted to ask you about collaboration with Jabir. How did that work, especially bridging the gap between the personal and the research and scholarly work?
Yes, so I mean, none of this research, neither Tadamun nor the Syrian Gulag, would be possible without my colleagues. Jabir Becker, who is a bit younger than me, who was studying mechanical engineering in Syria, and he was basically determined to have a relatively humdrum life in that in the society. When one day he was arrested, he's written about it for New Lines, actually, for the magazine. He was arrested. He was put in first in the Palestine branch and then in Saydnaya. So there's 2 years in Saydnaya for a young man for broaching a very simple discussion topic. And then he came out, etc. You should read the essay on his autobiography. But I met him in 2017 because he presented his book on Hospital 601, which is the infamous Caesar photos, those of you who know. And I met him, and we started talking about why this book doesn't exist, and our discussions deepened. And then we realized that actually we would make a good team in writing such a book, because I was familiar more with kind of broader Middle Eastern history, theories of violence, and Jabir, of course, had a very detailed knowledge of the Syrian prisons, because as soon as he came out, he became de facto a researcher of the Syrian prisons. And he himself will say, or he would joke, he will say, I became a researcher and I dropped mechanical engineering the first day I was in prison, because the moment that you're there, you're observing and you're trying to understand what's going on. And our collaboration worked really hand in glove. Right? So he had the empirical depth, so that he was very close to the data. He had a wide network, of course, of friends, comrades who had been in prison, who had survived. And I was working more on kind of historiography or the broader scholarship, how it would fit, how such a book would look, for example. And that collaboration worked for a couple of years. It was a little difficult, of course, in the pandemic, but in the end, it worked out, and it still goes on right now.
So you mentioned he was in prison. It seems like from the article that he wrote, it was bogus charges. It wasn't really, someone wrote, like reported him to the Mukhabarat, and then they got him. And then that's basically, you're in the system, that means like there's no way to get out of it, right? Mm-hmm. Can you know, because that part is interesting, the kind of the absurdity of a lot of those political prisoners. So it's not just you're in there because you have done something and you're being punished for it. Sometimes it's bogus charges, or even someone, you know, just vindictive, someone just wants to get you into trouble. You read the Shell. I think it was also another example of someone who is being charged as an Islamist, part of the Muslim Brotherhood, but is actually a Christian. Can you tell us about that? Kind of maybe it came through your book, the absurdity of Syrian prisons.
Yeah, no, that's really important and terrific, because for in Jabir's particular case, it was the accusation was that he wanted to join the Freemasons, which was absolutely absurd. But he was reading a book, and that's already, you know, profoundly dangerous. And the absurdity of the prison system actually then sometimes it borders kind of almost dark humor. And so it's so absurd, and people are survivors to themselves. They're so incredulous about what happened to them that they often feel that this is a kind of a dark comedy, actually, what they're living in, but a brutal one. And for most people that we interviewed, and there were admittedly some people who, for example, who genuinely were in the Communist Party, right? So a number of them have written memoirs about that as well. or some people who in a private apartment in Damascus, 3 people got together to talk about politics, right? And in more normal societies, let's say, that would be totally normal. It's not even congregation because it's in a private house, but those people were arrested for that. And then it becomes more absurd. For example, somebody was arrested, one of the interviewees, a young man, was arrested for allegedly having stolen a tank from the Syrian army, right? And he lives in a small apartment with his mother. So where would he even drive a tank in the middle of Damascus and then park it on the balcony of the? But see, the moment that you start pointing out the obvious to the mukhabarat, you only get tortured harder. So they try to elicit confessions actually by coming with these absurd charges.
But explain that to me, so we can talk about the officers there. So these officers are typically not educated or well-educated officers who are like, you know, the kind of the end machine of the prisoners. So when they get someone like that and they're accused of something and they talk to them, don't they have like a proper conversation before? Or?
Yes, I mean one of the things we also try to do in the book is to shed light also on the perpetrators, because invariably most books about camps, for example, are about survivors, and their voices have to be front and center, of course. But we were also interested in who are these people who do the torturing? Like, how does the day of the torturer look? Right? He wakes up in the morning, he kisses his kids, and he says goodbye, bye honey, to his wife, and then he goes to work, tortures people for 6-7 hours, and then comes back home. So how does he compartmentalize that in his mind? And there are a number of hints, for example, in these kind of in the interrogation room. One man who was originally from Deir ez-Zor but grew up in Damascus. He had a couple of clothing stores, so he was a businessman. And he was arrested at a protest because he joined in and he thought it's a mass protest, you know. But then the militias came in and the mukhabarat came in, arrested him, took him to the branch, and while they were beating him up, they said, "You're a businessman, right? Okay. How much money did you get from the Americans to organize this demonstration?" And then he said, "I don't need money from the Americans. I have 7 clothing stores." Aha. How much money did you give to the demonstrators then, so they would go out and demonstrate, right? So you're damned if you do, you're damned if you don't. That's the kind of absurd microcosm of these type of torturing situations.
Yeah, that's kind of one of the things that fascinates me as a Syrian. I had like a little insight into how that works. I was in prison, luckily. But I remember once I invited a few friends from Europe to visit me. I come from a little town along the Iraqi-Syrian border, and at the time it was not far from like after the Iraq War, so the environment was a bit tense. But I foolishly invited a few of my friends to visit there, and strangely, just kind of give you maybe you can build on that. When I was living in Damascus, in a place that it didn't have addresses, like you can't say, for example, I live in that street. There's no such things, right? So it'd be like, just take a bus, you know where you live, and that's it. The next day, I arrived back in Damascus. The grocer's shop that I buy things from next door had a paper. They don't even know my name, the grocery shop. That said, there's, you're summoned to the Palestinian branch, which is where things start. And you go the first day, that's usually the typical scenario. You go the first day, you wait for hours, they say the officer is delayed, just wait, and so they deliberately make you wait all the way until almost the end of the working hours, and then say the officer couldn't make it today, maybe tomorrow. So they make sure you come back the next day, kind of psychologically, it's insane. The next day, you sit there, and the conversation with the officer is interesting because he is, like I said, he's not educated, but there is a sort of philosophy that comes across. The Ba'athist philosophy comes across even in the most vernacular way of conversation, having that conversation with you. So they will ask you, who are these people? What kind of conversation you had with them, and things like that. So I would, I'm confident, like just that that's not an issue. So I would say, we kind of, for example, debated religion and stuff like that. And for an officer like that who's a secular and kind of an Alawite, I would say, in my mind, that is not an offense, because they don't like religion, they don't like fundamentalism and so on and so forth. But then the argument that he made is actually interesting for the Ba'athist regime. He says that's actually more, these kind of conversation, people who are coming from Europe, they're Christians and they try to undermine Islam. To me, that's actually more subversive than fundamentalist, because this is cultural invasion. They're trying to undermine our culture and so on. So for someone who's like a regular officer, not educated, not religious in any way, to say that, that's interesting to me. That was like, that stuck in my mind. Maybe you can build on some kind of, just the psychology of not just the prisoners, the people who go there, but also, like you said, the perpetrator.
Well, the metaphor that we use is, there are two ways of building a sculpture. Right? So you can take clay, and then you can build it from the inside out, and then you chip away a bit. Or you can take just a solid piece of rock and then chisel away until something emerges. So the way that, since we can't do it in the first method, we can't go to the archives in Syria, in Damascus, and walk into the Palestine branch and say, hi, I'm a historian and I would like to write a history of the prison system. That, of course, is never going to happen. So we have to do it in the second way. We have to paint a picture from the regime through the experience, collective experiences of the detainees. And that was possible because of the advantage of having obviously so many Syrian refugees in Europe, is that people were relatively free and safe to speak up, also anonymously, for example. And second, there was the time and the space to do these interviews, right? Because inside Syria, whatever region, it would be almost impossible. People are terrified. And even in some adjacent countries, for example, especially Lebanon, that would have been difficult. So we painted a picture of the mukhabarat, for example, through the collective experiences of the detainees, supplemented with leaked files, for example. Right? So the Commission of International Justice and Accountability has a number of leaked files of the intelligence. It's really interesting to look at those. There are a number of defectors. There's also a number of army defectors who had contact, of course, intense contact with mukhabarat. And then there's the kind of catfishing method that we use. And if you put that all together, then, but that's a separate study that should be written, focusing only on the system of perpetration. What makes these people tick? What makes them, what motivates them? The Baathism was one thing. There are, of course, unmistakable, cannot be denied in any way, unmistakable sectarian motives. You already mentioned that a bit, among the perpetrators. And then there are entirely private motives as well. So one person that we interviewed was a highly intelligent young man from Aleppo. Even went to a class of like mutafawiqin, so the type of kids who score really high on their tests, and he had a nemesis in that class. And the nemesis in the end ended up joining the mukhabarat. And when the uprising began in 2011, the cleavage went that our friend, he went and he supported the uprising digitally, electronically. And then the other person started hunting him purely for the reason that he was jealous, and he was resentful over the fact that the other kid always had better grades, right? So he didn't get his hands on him, but they heard that he was hunting him, for example. Or another example is, how does the regime treat minority detainees, so detainees from minorities, such as from the Druze, the Ismailis, the Alawites, Christians, etc., and beyond. And one man that we interviewed, who was a middle-aged Alawite man from Homs, he said that he was arrested and there was particularly violent vitriol towards him. Like, how dare you, of all people? We expected of the rest of these people, but you are one of us. And while they were torturing him, so the torturer asks him, what is the secret of the Alawites? Tell us that. And he, of course, understood that if he says the secret, then he gave up the secret, he will be tortured. If he doesn't say the secret, then he doesn't know, which means he will be tortured. So he's damned if he does, and he's damned if he doesn't. So these collective experiences help us understand actually the motives of the perpetrators quite a bit.
What about the victims? So Jabir couldn't make it here, but how did he deal with this? So how many years did he spend in prison? Like several years, right?
2 years, a bit more.
2 years, okay. So how did he deal? Like there was no closure, as they say. You know, like there's no, you're free because you're innocent, or we apologize or something. What happened then? And how did he deal with it after?
I mean, in a way, Jaber's experience, I think, is also exemplary, actually, for possibly hundreds of thousands of others. We don't know exactly how many people were in prison, but it's in the that's an exceptionally high number, especially per thousand capita of the population. No, there's no closure. There's no apology. There's no transitional justice in any way, if you want to use that term, which galvanizes people in various ways. The fact, and most of the victims that we interviewed, survivors, they felt a sense of kind of unfulfilled, unrequited justice, and the search for justice. And we told them openly when we interviewed them. First of all, it was difficult, sometimes re-traumatizing for them to talk about it. We have a trauma center in Amsterdam and also in France, so we would refer people to it. If this opens up a bunch of memories that you want to talk about later professionally, that can be done. But the profound sense of, growing up, especially for the older detainees, growing up in a society in which the state arrests you, tortures you, lets you go, and then denies that all those things happen to you, right? So, and the injustice of having to swallow that for years and years and years on end, and then the dam breaks, the wall of fear crumbles. That's the search for the truth. Actually, if there's one thing that all of those interviewees had in common, is that they wanted to help us. They wanted to give us their stories because we were looking for the truth, and especially in a society or in a regime that is fundamentally an enemy of the truth, that spreads false information, misinformation, fake news, etc., manipulates, mystifies, you name it. This was actually, for most survivors, actually, this was what was really worth it for the book, the search for the truth.
And then even if they leave prison, like you hinted to, they're still almost like an open air prison. I remember Khalifa, Khalid Khalifa, was it? Who was also in prison for probably 2 decades. He had to navigate, like find ways to kind of get himself out of Syria. Otherwise, he's stuck. Like as a former prisoner, there's no way he can move. So that's the same with Jaber and others?
Absolutely, and Jaber will talk about there's different levels of imprisonment. So he experienced with a number of other people, like primary school and secondary school as a form of detention, as a total institution. The schools also look ugly. The teacher beats you whenever he wants. So he argues actually that was one level, and then the entire country is a prison. You don't have a passport, you can't go anywhere you want. So that definitely was an element of it, so it seeps through. But it also, those people who were released, then you're back in Damascus, and then there's a stigma. That guy was in prison. Stay away from him, he's trouble. So he doesn't get a job, can't get married, can't become a civil servant. So there's levels of stigma and ostracism, even way after you've been released. And that's the gulag element of it, let's say. So the disproportionate impact on the society. One man that we interviewed, for example, and I felt absolutely terrible for him. Like, he was in his late 50s when the revolution began. And then, like so many Syrians, he left in 2016. And then for the first time, he had the chance of talking about how it felt to grow up in Syria while his father was imprisoned. And so he suffered neighborhood kids bullying him, Abu Mahbous, they call him, his father is a prisoner. He had the stigma that whenever he applied for a job, wherever he went, they would say, wait a minute, isn't that, yes, that's that guy's son, no job for him. The mukhabarat would bully him in terms of visits, for example, to his father was highly regulated, and when they would see his father, he was a devastated man. So this is somebody who grew up without a father, therefore never married and had children. And so the social devastation that you see, that's a separate book that again has to be written about. Not just the detainees, but the disproportionate impact beyond society, intergenerational and whatnot.
Wow. I want to open it up also for questions. If anybody has questions, please jump in. The mic, okay. But I also, in the meantime, while we get in someone inspired to ask a question, can we talk about the language? the culture of prisons. Seems like it's not the experience of prisons. It's not just limited to the building, and not to the perpetrator and the victims, but also it's almost like part of the lingo, the street language of Syrians, because it just permeates through society. For example, you know, like you mentioned, I think, you know, come drink coffee. That's a euphemism for being summoned and interrogated and so on and so forth. That could also lead to just being in the system for a long time. I think also, you know, if you the word for prisons sometimes is like euphemistically is like Beit Khalto, right? His aunt's house. That means like you're going to prison. That, you know, like euphemism as well. Like just from your academic experience, kind of what is that as part of the the collective psyche of people? Is that part of the thinking? Is that just an outcome of it?
No, this is exactly part. I mean, it's a vector of the disproportionate impact on the culture. So even the popular culture becomes infused with prison jargon, for example, or with references to imprisonment, or even the silences and the taboos. Even they are an important part of it. And there are some people in this room also who worked on the language of prisons. Maybe they can speak on that. But the first time, I mean, for me, that was I'll tell you an anecdote about that, also about the collaboration with Jaber. So at some point, this was it was in the pandemic, so it had to be outside. In the summer, I think of 2020, a group of former detainees in the Netherlands, old guys from the 70s and from the 80s, they decided to get together on a picnic, and they had to do it outside because of the pandemic. And so they rented a farm, and the farm has outside seating areas, etc. So we went there with Jaber. Jaber said, "You have to see this. This is an old get-together, like a reunion of many people who haven't seen each other for a long time." So we went there, and it's interesting is that there were both people from the Communist Party, but also people from the Muslim Brotherhood. They were all together because they shared the same experience. And there were at least 20, 25 people there. And they sat down on like a long table, and I sat in a corner with Jaber, and they dove into this jargon that I thought it was pretty fluent in Shami, in Syrian Arabic, but I had no idea what they were talking about. And I asked Jaber, "What's going on?" He started laughing, like, "Yeah, you don't know the prison lingo. That's why you don't understand." So,
like a cryptic.
Exactly, and so that's. But I know that people are studying that. So, yeah.
Interesting. Like even the words like, you know, walls here, like have ears and things like that. So instead of telling your kid, don't speak about this like because it's political, you have to have a phrase that where the warning is embedded in it. You know, walls have ears. Mm-hmm. Your aunt's house, things like that, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Is that part of the thing?
Yeah.
So I have more questions, but I want to kind of leave others.
Yeah, thank you very much. I have two questions. The first one, the German-American philosopher Hannah Arendt wrote about the banality of evil when he wrote about Eichmann in Jerusalem, and her ideas about that the perpetrators of these kind of violence are people who are thoughtless. They don't have this capacity to reflect on their actions. And do you see this interpretation or explanation holds in the Syrian case? And the second one, I know from Saudi Arabia that people who work on this kind of political prisons, and they get their training from the Americans, from FBI, and etc. In Syria, what is the school of thought, if we can say that? What is the influence? Is it East Germany? Because I read something, it's East Germany that they learned the trade from there, etc. Thank you.
So I mean, there are a number of people about the perpetrators. I mean, I think both the notion that perpetrators are like uniquely evil, or that they're banal, is wrong. I think that is, both of them are a reduction actually of the complexity of their personalities and of their profession. There are of course a lot of people who disagreed also with Arendt, the notion of banality. If we take our gentleman, for example, Amjad Yusuf, colonel in the military intelligence, then what you see is, I mean, there are two things important about him. One is that he was born into a society, but also a family and a village, where it wasn't predestined for him to become military intelligence official, but there was some what we call path dependence. So it was relatively easy for him to, right? If you were born into a family of businessmen, chances are that it would be relatively easier for you to make a career in that, for example. So that's one thing, because his father was already he was in the intelligence in the early days of Hafiz Assad. Not to mention he comes from a firmly, staunchly pro-regime village and community and family. That's one thing. And the second is, but it doesn't predestine it yet. The second is that, of course, the regime, the Assad regime, has an intelligence academy. And that's where you learn the techniques of how to be an intelligence official. And again, nobody walks in there and looks at the archives or starts asking questions. But what we know from it, for example, is that they teach you also in behavioral control, self-control. And you see that in the video as well. Like this is, I mean, the Tadamun videos are unique in the way that never before have we been able to look the perpetrator direct in the face while he's committing the violence. And we've certainly never done that in the case of Syria, right? So the best you could do is some guy called Abu Haidar, something, who picks you up, and then there's kind of, almost a reign of terror with the personal individual, and you might ask questions and try to find out where he's from, etc. But for most people, it was like these people are ghosts. They come in, they snatch you away, but you don't know anything about them. And we know we know quite a bit about this individual. So the one thing is the path dependence, and the second thing is that the regime trains these people. In essence, if it was you or me, for example, going in through these military academies, these intelligence academies, it would maybe take us a bit longer because for us the threshold would be maybe a bit higher, but it's in principle not entirely impossible to make these type of killers when you live and work in an institutional environment like that. And that's something that shouldn't be forgotten. I mean, there's some colleagues of mine who, in the field of violence research, who argue there are no violent people, there are only violent situations. And I find that too situational, right? So, I mean, there are some people like Jaber who are almost the same age as Amjad, and he grew up was born in a different community, a different family, in a different political identity, and their lives are very different, of course. But both of these are Syrian lives. That's one, I think that's one possible answer. And then the roots of the Syrian prison system are, in a nutshell, it has multiple roots, right? And there's a lot of kind of conspiracy theory. Well, it was the Stasi, the German Democratic Republic intelligence, the communist intelligence agency that trained the Syrians, and as if the Syrians wouldn't be capable enough to be perfectly capable and violent of themselves. As if, for example, the French colonial authorities were not the ones who established Mezze prison. And as if in the Ottoman Empire for 500 years there were no prisons and there was no torture. No, in fact, the most common torture techniques, not with electricity and with radio electricity, etc., but falaka, beating somebody under the soles of his feet, is a really old Ottoman technique. So those things are like, as a colleague of mine said, it's like a three-layer hummus dip, as they say, to use the Middle Eastern. So there's an Ottoman layer to it, there's a French layer to it, and then there's a Syrian post-colonial layer to it. But in essence, of course, the core of the cadre is Syrian.
A lot of people kind of trace it back to, was it the 60s, like almost like around the Nasser period, when there's a famous story that became, like in Damascus, shook the capital because they heard of a story of someone who's killed, and then his body was, they disposed of his body through acid. And that kind of, for the Syrian society at the time, was seen like unprecedented, never heard of. How does this gore come to society and portrayed by the state? Yeah. So it seems like people mark that as the beginning of this the state that Hafiz al-Assad inherited after that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, and this is one of the layers of violence that already exists, right? So another, for example, the moment of brutalization is when the First World War comes to Syria. I mean, the major memories in Syrian families are Seferberlik, which is a Turkish word, Seferberlik, which means mobilization. And that was a major moment of brutalization as well. All of a sudden, all the men in the village are gone. They either ran off into the mountains, they don't want to serve, or they all died in Erzurum fighting against the Russians. So, what a shock to a society that happens. And then on top of that, of course, you have the coup d'états after independence. You have 8 coup d'états in a few years. That also, of course, it changes and brutalizes the political culture. Some guy in a uniform runs the country. I take a gun, I shoot that guy, I become that guy. You know, in terms of peaceful transfer of power, we're dealing with really different type elements to it. Yeah. But the Assad regime, we can argue, I mean, it has a unique incorporation of these different forms of violence and unleashing them on Syrian society. That is unprecedented.
Yeah. Did you have a question there, or you gave up? Related to this, I mean, some people say, is it a coincidence that both Saddam Hussein and Hafez Assad have the same methods and they're both Ba'athist? So, is there a connection between them?
Yes, definitely many, and this is something that is kind of lasting interest of mine. The two very highly violent regimes in the history of the Middle East are the Ba'athist ones. So it's Saddam and it's Assad. And if you really look into it, and the literature is less developed because of the access and the number of scholars working on it, maybe it's less than, for example, those who work on violence in Turkey or Iran or Israel, for example. But if you take it seriously, then you see that there is like above average levels of violence in these two societies, and the question is, why is that? I mean, I don't have an easy answer. There's mutual radicalization. There's also ideological similarities, of course. For example, some Syrian intellectuals also who have argued that, for example, Ba'athist ideology was so far removed from mainstream Syria, is that it could only be done through violence and to impose the ideology on the society. That's one theory. I teach a course at the University of Amsterdam, a graduate course, which is called Mass Violence in Syria and Iraq. And I was teaching in the block is 8 weeks. And then the dean asked me, would you like to expand it? And I said, for how much then? And he said, if you want, you can do it 16 weeks. And I said, well, actually, unfortunately, I have enough material actually to do that course also 16 weeks. So, and that says, I think that says a lot. But that's really for future researchers to find out, I think. Why is it that these two, in a mutual violence as well, with the only two major, let's say, states that used wide campaigns of chemical weapons used against their own population? You know, that's a sad fact. But there are others who work on it.
Thank you. Could you discuss how the civil war starting in 2011 affected the prison system? Was it the system already in place when the war started, or did it evolve during the course of the war?
Yeah. No, that's a really good question. We look into that as well. And the answer, I think, is that the 4 dimensions of the Gulag, Syrian Gulag, were in principle confined to 3. To the Mukhabarat prisons, the central prisons, and the civil prisons. But as hundreds of thousands of people poured into the street and started demonstrating, the prisons were filled up to maximum capacity. People started also dying because of exposure, lack of medical care, etc. We've all seen the drawings, for example, of survivors who were packed like sardines in a can in these badly ventilated prisons, in these dungeons. There's not enough food for anyone and whatnot. So that's part of it, but also that 4th dimension, the secret prisons, those really expanded. So take the example of Aleppo. So the University of Aleppo is one of the largest universities really in the world. 100,000 students, many of them demonstrating. And at some point, my colleague Ali Al-Jassim, who's working on Aleppo, specifically on the Shabbiha paramilitaries in Aleppo, and he argued that actually any 3-4 Shabbiha groups that could get together could arrest someone with full impunity, arrest 1 or 2 people, and then take them to an apartment somewhere, lock them into a room, and just keep them there for as long as they want, and then hand them over, or interrogate them there, torture them there. So it basically gave a fiat to all these irregular militias to set up their own secret prisons. And some of the worst ones, such as Deir Shmeil, for example, north of Hama, it's a veritable kind of killing camp because there's no prison regime. There's no warden, there's no routines. The spaces are kind of ad hoc. Anybody can drag someone from the cell and execute them, for example, which has happened on a number of occasions. And many detainees who survived both, for example, mukhabarat prisons and secret prisons, they all invariably they said the secret prisons were much worse because there's no system and there's wanton, kind of whimsical violence. So many more people in prison, and the brutality of the violence went up quite a bit as well. So Jabir would say, when he was in prison, Jabir was in prison, his fellow, of course there was violence, but he says those of my comrades who stayed in prison and were released after 2011, so those people who straddled the beginning of the revolution, were released 2012. There are of course also a number of amnesties. They said that in 2011 the level of violence went up exponentially because the regime is panicking. And so that's when you started seeing torturing to death, which is something that became quite common. That's when you saw weekly executions in Saydnaya, for example, which we didn't see before. The more the regime was challenged, the higher the level of violence was.
I want, sorry, go ahead. Yeah.
One to follow up on that briefly. Investigators, folks who have been digging into these questions, right? You talk about mass extermination within the camps. What is to be expected if at any point in, say, the next 5-10 years that we are able to peel back? So you have the new mechanism for disappeared persons that may have jurisdiction to go in and do some levels of investigation. What is the expectation of what will be found? But also, are there any approaches that the international community should take when it comes to identifying those sources and those locations to be able to derive evidence of the, not just the torture, but also just the extermination component?
Yeah. I had a colleague who wasn't an expert on the Middle East, didn't work on the Middle East, but followed the news from Syria a bit. And when Assad retook territories and then the conflict froze with Idlib in the northeast, he said, well, it's a good thing the war is over, huh? So there's less violence. And I said, no, actually, the fact that there's quiet on the front doesn't mean there's less violence. It means actually that there's more violence, because it means that the prison system is working as usual. So now, all those territories where Assad was not in control, and those populations that it was not in control of, now it is. And the first thing it does, of course, such as in Ghouta, for example, I have a colleague work on, he works in the suburb of Arbin, and you see that very clearly. The regime takes over, and then immediately it knows. It has a blacklist. It knows exactly who organized the local coordination, who did the field hospitals, who was the media person in charge, etc., etc. So the regime is really the kind of chief sociologist of Syrian society. It knows its society backwards. So it goes in and it arrests these people and puts them in prison again. So the fact that the fighting ends doesn't mean the violence ends. No, the mukhabarat goes in and extracts. So that means this system is probably going to continue for a while, for a long time. What to do about it? No idea. But one hint into what could potentially be problems are actually in the Tadamun videos, not the one that went public and was leaked, but in some of the other ones that we describe in the piece. Amjad, in at least 3 of the videos, Amjad is seen driving a bulldozer, and he not only burnt the pit with the bodies, but then he shuffles through the mass grave with the bulldozer. Right? He takes up and he basically crunches into these bodies, takes a bit up, takes it somewhere else, and dumps it there. Who told him to do that? Like, why is he doing that? The victim's already dead. So clearly he's doing that to destroy the forensic evidence, to mess with the DNA, and this is what the Serbs did during the war in Yugoslavia when they destroyed the mass graves in Srebrenica. Right? It was extremely difficult to find a whole body, actually, with all limbs attached. So I think that let's say the regime falls tomorrow, investigators will have a very difficult time actually to find, let alone finding those secret sites, then uncovering them and finding DNA evidence and forensic evidence. It will be very difficult.
Thank you so much. I want to follow up actually on Jesse's question. We know there has been an effort, especially led by the Iranian government, to kind of like restructure and organize this chaos you mentioned at the beginning, where like you have one branch arresting someone, or one agency, sorry, arresting someone, and then the other agency waits until the first agency is done to arrest the same person and see if they can get better information or not. The Iranians started Al-Ghadir project in the early 2000s, first to digitize the whole intelligence system, so at least it's not paper record, it's digital. And then after the killing of the crisis cell in 2012, there was a whole restructure where we see Ali Mamlouk is at the National Security Office, and you see kind of like more control over those 4 agencies. In a sense, do you think that would be, how first, were you able to document what difference there were and how the different agencies are dealing with detainees after this restructuring? And I think this restructuring didn't take effect until maybe 2015 or 2016. So later, as you said, when the violence became more secret than public. And 2, do you think that would actually be helpful in the day after, in the sense of getting more data? If you can give us some insights about like the data aspect. What we hear about is that actually, because the regime is well organized, that they can actually keep data about everything. Who wrote the report in the first place? Who led the interrogation? Who asked for the arrest? Who led the torture? If someone is killed, where that body is killed. Did you get hints of that? Do you think it would be helpful for the day after?
Yeah. No, this is really important, of course, because you have to start thinking about that already now. The earlier, the better. I mean, first and foremost, I have to say, I mean, there were 2 major actors in the whole conflict that were unresearchable. That was the regime and that was ISIS. Because in both, you don't just walk in and start asking questions. So whatever you say or do or think about the regime is like it's like a Kremlinology. You know, we have no idea what's happening inside, but yeah, let's through gossip and that's why I think catfishing is important. There's no other way to do it. You know, bring me better data then. You know, it doesn't exist. So that's one kind of disclaimer. But there, the fact that the regime went to better records also meant a more precise form of violence, if you will. I'll give you an example. There's a Dutch lawyer who defended a lot of refugees from the 1970s onwards, down to 2010, and then he retired, and he donated his archive to an institute. And I've been having conversations with him, and he allowed me to look at some of his files. And these are like asylum applications, in which you have to explain why you are applying for asylum. So they're also highly sensitive files. And he told me you can quote from them, they're my personal files, but you can't use any names. And we use them in the book as well, but they're all anonymous. And one of them was a Kurdish Syrian man who was traveling, a normal guy, middle-class guy, was a teacher. And at some point he's arrested when he arrives in Hasakeh. He's there visiting friends, and then they arrest him. Political security takes him away and tortures him. And in the after like a week or 2, they realize actually this is not the guy they need. Why? Because he has the same first and last name of the guy they really want. So they ask him, you know, tell me about your brother in Romania. What is he doing about the anti-regime activity? And he says, we have absolutely no family outside of the country because we're maktumin, we have no papers even. And they keep torturing him. And in the end, they realize this is not the guy. This is a Tashabah Isma, so it has the same, coincidentally, the same name. Then they let him go. They dump him in the streets with nothing. So he goes back home. But these type of things, for example, were, after the digitization, became a little bit more precise. Because, and those Syrians who went through checkpoints, for example, after the major digitization, also now, they know that there's a checkpoint and it looks kind of primitive. The cinder block and then the 2 guys drinking mate in the little cottage. And next to it is a guy with a computer. And that's when you know that you can't talk your way through, you can't schmooze your way through it anymore, because they have really precise data. So the technology we say helped on the one hand the opposition in many ways, but it helped us too in the investigation. But technology also definitely helps the regime in becoming ever more sophisticated in their surveillance and violence.
Can we maybe end it with, based on your book and based on your research, what kind of areas of interest that you think others can pick up, in terms of research, stories that you think are not are not highlighted enough in the media, things like that?
Well, we were sitting together in a cafe right before, and somebody told an anecdote, and then somebody else said, "Well, that's a movie right there. It was somebody's biography." And to be honest, I mean, every single Syrian who we interviewed, and some of them were even never in prison. You know, I look at the biographies thinking, "Wow, that's a movie right there, or that is a story right there. That's a book or a biography right there." So I think a broader documentation and publications on even ordinary Syrian lives, because they're not extraordinary, they're quite extraordinary. That's one important thing, I think, because people don't necessarily write themselves, so somebody has to go do it. That's one thing. And then, of course, the broader impact on the society, as we said. So we stick to the prisons, but there's a much wider impact on the society of the prison system, and how, you know, what type of impacts we need to look at, what type of cultural traumas there are, the impact that it had also on this, you know, the stultifying experience on Syrian society. People who lost education, people whose marriages broke up, whose friendships broke up, you know, the lack of political engagement. All of those things have an impact, of course, and I think somebody else should maybe do that research.
So that part of storytelling is exactly also one of the things that we found in our, in journalism, is most of the kind of the powerful ideas and stories that you know you can find in any conflict are the stories that are untold. Obviously, the stories that can't be told. Let's say maybe the person who has the most powerful stories doesn't have the access to journalism, for example, to write their story. But also there's structural setback from the media that doesn't, they wouldn't be interested, for example, in pursuing a story from someone that would require a lot of work, and they would, either see someone who's tweeting a lot and seems like they have a lot of followers and are articulate about what they are writing about. But if someone sends them an idea and it's not developed enough, but there is an element of like something interesting there, these get ignored. Something we wrote about before, how this is something we try to rectify, for example, in the media, in the magazine, maybe to kind of speak about ourselves in this case, is we go and tell a story from someone who maybe hasn't had that experience writing. They're not natural writers, and we try to get them to write their story, help them. That's not easy. I'm sure you've probably gone through this experience. Sometimes it takes a whole year to develop one story, but that story is really worth keeping for history books. So to your point, I think much of the Syrian conflict is not told, because the real stories, the stories that are, that tell you maybe bigger ideas, or not, are left in the dark because of this kind of lack of access. And Syria is an especially relevant example in this, because Syrians are educated mostly in Arabic, rather like, in Lebanon, for example, people grow up speaking 2 or 3 languages. Elsewhere, they do the same. But in Syria, unless you have to learn English, a lot of people don't have that access to the outside world in terms of telling their stories. This has been sobering, very interesting, that's sad, obviously, at the same time. So thank you for making the time, and thank you, everybody, for coming along. Thank you.